Welcome everyone. Welcome to this live but online event at the Swindon Festival of Literature 2021. Thank you very much for joining us, everyone. We do hope that everything is well where you are. Now, this event is being presented in association with the Swindon Philosophical Society, a keen and questioning band of men and women, if ever there were any. Please note, this event is being both recorded and live streamed online, but only the host, the author, and the interviewers will be seen, so don't worry. If you would like to ask a question, please type it in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. If your question is chosen, you have a choice of asking your question in person and being seen on live stream, or asking the host to ask it on your behalf. If you want your question to be asked but do not want to be seen, please prefix your question with unseen. Phew, hope that's all clear. Now, it's local election results day today, on which politicians from big parties have been voted in largely on well-intended big promises and by large numbers of people who agree with them. But what about the small parties who have no voice in the big decision-making now? The small groups with ideals and promises of their own. Where are they now? How can they have a say? And should they? Today's guest author of a book titled The Social Edge, The Power of Sympathy Groups for Our Health, Wealth and Sustainable Future, here it is, may have some answers. And today's guest interviewers, and you, dear potentially worldwide audience, may also have some questions. Please join me in giving a Swindon Festival of Literature and a Swindon Philosophical Society welcome to guest co-interviewers Louisa Davison and Paul Archer, and today's guest author and award-winning scientist and researcher, Professor Anthony Costello. Welcome, everyone. Like to hear from you, please?
From me, yeah.
Or just a word?
Just a word.
And the other two?
I have actually been to Swindon in the past. I've often been through it on the station because my son was at university in Bristol. And I remember once my wife and I stayed at a fantastic hotel just outside Swindon. I can't remember the name of the hotel because it was about 20 years ago. But what I forever associate Swindon with is Dom Rogers, the great football player who played for Swindon Town. That's going back a few years, but he was a wonderful player. And Swindon have always had a reputation for exciting and attacking football. I think your manager was once Lou Macari, but that's all I know, really.
Anthony, you've started us on a topic. We could go on. 1969 League Cup final against Arsenal. Don Rogers scored. Yeah, he ran through the mud and scored. Hey, we can't do this. This is, we're on another topic. Hey, back to your book, The Power of Sympathy Groups, about which it is said, we're obsessed with finding big, complicated technological solutions to many modern ills. But what if the answers lie not in big techno fixes, but in harnessing the power of one of the oldest and best tried human units, the sympathy group? Anthony, please tell us more.
Thank you very much. And I'm slightly intimidated having to speak to the Swindon Philosophical Society as well. But I'm going to share my screen, and which is here. I hope this will work. And I'll play it there. Is that okay? Can everybody see that? I hope so. So I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, 25, on issues around cooperation and what's called sympathy groups. And to set the thing in context, the book, which is shown here, the contents page, really has 5 sections to it. And we'll only touch on some of these issues. One is to describe what a sympathy group actually is. Then I had a section talking about what sounds interesting, trials of wicked women. Actually, it's trials, controlled trials of working with women's groups addressing wicked problems. And I'll come on to that. a whole section about the interesting issue that development of countries fundamentally is about building trust, in my view. And then a number of 22 experiments, which I think are relevant to the 21st century. And finally, there was a whole section about sympathy groups going into policy. And I'm sure some of this will come up in questioning as well. But just to kick off, what is a sympathy group? Actually, when we started all our research, because the book actually originated from research that began back in the 1990s, when we started doing studies in Nepal and then subsequently India and Bangladesh and Malawi, and I'll come on to that. And it was only much later that I discovered the work of Robin Dunbar. And Robin Dunbar is an anthropologist from Oxford, not far from Swindon, who talks about human groups not being random, but actually part of a tripling hierarchy. So you have your kind of close family friends who look after you when you have a stroke or something, your survival clique, and then you triple that up to the sympathy group on average, which will be your local neighbors or friendship groups that will enable you to conduct a lot of interesting things. And then you have your affinity band and up to your active network. And that's the Dunbar number. He thinks that about 150, obviously there's a wide variation here, but that's the limits of your social cognitive brain. That's the number of people, that's your kind of Christmas card list. It's the size of a rural village or the size of a parish or of a one of the, I can't remember the exact level of the army that represents, but it's you know, it's at a certain level. And that's interesting because in this tripling environment, different things kick into play. And if you go back through history, each of them play a role in the way history has developed. But sympathy groups, which I put in red, became of interest to me for reasons that I'll explain. And I wrote it in this book, which is weird because it's a mixture of kind of scientific research and stories that I find interesting and a bit of humor and some policy stuff. And it's a bit long. My wife thinks it's 2 books. It shouldn't have been 1, but yeah, there you go. So let's look at sympathy groups. If you go back through our human history, so hunter-gatherers, that's our condition for like 200,000 years. Hunters and gatherers operate in groups, and they're usually groups of anything between sort of 7 and 20. And then you come on, if you come to, for example, the 18th century, the birth of the Industrial Revolution, coffee houses were the engine of so much debate and innovation. And London and the rest of the country were full of coffee houses with various people meeting and debating and coming up with ideas. You can see there a suffragette group from 1882. Actually, that was in New Zealand, part of the colonial empire then. Groups of women's groups throughout history have played an important role, from gathering food through to nurturing care and the like. Theatre, of course, which is 5,000 years old, that's Peter Brook, bottom left, who was directing a play in Paris, I think. But theatre is a classic sympathy group with an enabler, a group of like-minded people coming up with a focused, iterative performance that's based on trust and based on the strategies developed by the director. And then bottom right is Sir Joni Ive and the design team at Apple, who came up with the iPod, the iPhone, the iThis, the iThat, but which has really transformed 21st century communications and interactions for good and bad. And then, of course, in politics, you have classic sympathy groups around a leader, a strong leader. So this is Putin's sympathy group. We could have looked at Trump or Boris Johnson. And it's usually cabinet, but it may be more inner than that, because cabinet may include people that actually the central leader is not that close to. And of course, sympathy groups can be both destructive and constructive. This is the group of 15 that caused the 9/11. This is the sympathy group of Navy SEALs that killed Osama bin Laden. So because a sympathy group is powerful and creative, it can be used in different ways. Now, basically, groups are about power. Power is everywhere. Hannah Arendt said, unless you have groups, you cannot talk about power. And we all know that power is in our everyday relationships, within our family and outside. I'm a medical professional. I know that the hierarchies of power are very real within the health sector, but I'm sure in all realms of activity that you're all engaged with, you'll know about power relations. We know that the Bullingdon Club mentality is quite strong in British government today, right now. We know that caste structures are very predominant in places like India, Nepal, which I know well. And that's a picture actually of the communists, the royalists, the United Marxist-Leninist leaders, and all of them come from the same caste. They're all Brahmins. And this is a picture of a meeting in the White House chaired by whoever the vice president was. I think I've forgotten his name right now. And that was a meeting to discuss the reproductive rights of women. So power is about groups and group identity. And I'm going to explore whether or not using sympathy groups in a more creative way could solve some of the contemporary challenges that we face. So this is a picture of the Siena Hospedale in Italy, which I visited. And these are frescoes by Domenico di Bartoli, painted in about 1440. And they show various stages of the hospital activity, some surgery, a guy on the left having a urine test. At the back, the hospital committee in their black hats. To the right, end of life care by an oblate friar, and various animals wandering around. So an intensely social place. And the next fresco shows on the left a women's group, actually a wet nursing group of women who would look after and feed the abandoned or orphaned babies found in Siena streets. And on the right, you can see the betrothal of one of those babies who's now grown up to be a young woman, being reintegrated into society through the social role of the hospital to a local man. So, you know, we were very comfortable with the social function of health 500, 600, 700 years ago. We seem to have forgotten it in some ways in aspects of our healthcare today. So I became interested in this through a negative experiment. I was interested in health education and have been working. I lived in Nepal for a few years, and then we set up some studies with a local group, and we decided in the 1990s to do a randomized controlled trial of health education, because everyone was saying it was a good thing to do, but nobody had really evaluated it. And so we set up a trial at the maternity hospital, which largely dealt with slum-dwelling families. And we gave a traditional kind of 40-minute dose of interactive health education prior to discharge. And again, we repeated that in the patient's home. And we showed no impact whatsoever on a whole range of outcomes to do with knowledge, attitudes, and practices around infant care and danger signs and outcomes, which was rather disappointing, but in fact was one of the few trials that had been done at that time of traditional health education. Then we heard about a program in Bolivia in the mountains of the Andes, where women have been brought together in groups in remote villages where healthcare was very difficult to reach and seemed to be showing benefits. And we wondered whether this approach which was called PLA, and PLA stood for Participatory Learning and Action. And basically the women would meet together probably once every 2 to 4 weeks, come together, talk about their problems, think about strategies that they could do to address them within their own context, put them into practice, evaluate them together, and go around this kind of typical audit cycle that I'm sure all of you would be familiar with in various aspects of your work. It's a standard way of doing management and learning and the like. And so we wondered, would this work in Nepal? And instead of sticking to the urban center of Kathmandu, we went out 6 hours drive away to a district called Makwanpur, which was a large district of 1,500 square kilometers of mountains like this with scattered homesteads, and where access to healthcare was actually very poor, and where most people delivered at home at that time, and where there was a burgeoning civil war, which we didn't really realize when we started. But during this whole study, they did have troops, and our field workers had to kind of negotiate their way between security forces and Maoist insurgents, which became difficult later in the study. And so what we did was adapted the Bolivian model and set up local groups where there was a woman facilitator that we chose. She was not a health worker. She was trained how to set up groups, bring people together. We gave them a curriculum for discussion, but they were very much free to talk about things they wanted to talk about. And this woman would run 9 monthly women's groups going around to different wards, and they would go through a cycle to discuss local problems. And pretty quickly, after about a year of doing this, I thought, this is very interesting, but there's no way it can have any impact, because we worked out that probably only about 8 or 9% of women of reproductive age were actually joining our groups. And so we carried on, and we did this as what's called a cluster randomized controlled trial. So the red areas here were randomly chosen. Each of those was about 60 square kilometers, so quite big. And the blue areas were control areas where we didn't do women's groups to talk about perinatal health. And we chose outcome was to be a hard measure of newborn mortality rates. So we knew they were fairly high at baseline, and we wanted to see whether we would have an impact. And to our surprise, the women got involved in all kinds of things, from designing their own safe delivery kits. Almost all of them set up revolving credit schemes. They made sure that local men would have transport schemes. Some got into kitchen gardening, some did water protection, a whole variety of things. And at the end of it, I thought, well, we won't get a positive result, but it's been quite interesting. And we showed a 30% reduction in newborn mortality from chatting. And it was quite big. I mean, we covered 170,000 people, and there were 6,200 births. And we published it in the Lancet, and we expected this might change global policy. And the silence was deafening. In fact, somebody from the Gates Foundation came up to me and said, "You're not seriously saying that chatting will reduce deaths, are you?" And we said, "Well, actually, we are, yeah." And they laughed at us. So subsequently, to cut a very long story short, we set up 7 cluster randomized trials to try and replicate this, to see whether it was a chance finding or whether we could genuinely replicate it. So we set one up in Ekjut in East India, the forests of Jharkhand at the south of Bihar state, 2 in Malawi in different areas, in Bangladesh, an even bigger study, and 1 in urban Mumbai, with different partners. All of these were with local partners who we identified as strong and had the ability to do the research we wanted to do. And this was the East India study. a much better study, more clusters than in the Nepal study. And again, to our very pleasant surprise, we showed very similar result, 32% reduction in newborn mortality. And we also looked at maternal depression rates, which we thought might be another primary outcome. And that showed in moderate to severe depression, a 57% reduction as a result of engaging women in groups and allowing them to partake in this PLA system. So that was very encouraging. And we then set up, as I said, a much bigger study in Bangladesh across 3 districts with 36,000 births from a population of 500,000. So these are not small single village projects. These are very large scale projects that we wanted to be at scale because we wanted them to have relevance to policy. And we showed no impact in Bangladesh. Nothing, no impact on mortality or on practices. And my colleague there, Kishwar Azad, she's a pediatrician, she'd been the leader there. She was furious with me. She said, hang on, how come we didn't make any impact, but in Nepal and India they did? And I said, well, maybe we got this, maybe women talk differently in Bangladesh. And so she hit me and said, no, that's not true. And we wondered whether they were more conservative, but actually one of the districts was conservative, but the 2 others were not too bad. And then we realized we got the coverage wrong, that actually we got the dose wrong, that they had a much more densely populated areas and that we only had 1 facilitator to about 1,500 population, whereas in the others it was about 1 to 500 or 600 population. So we then said, well, we're going to have to repeat the study. And we had some money, and it's a long story, but we repeated it and took another 3 years of a trial. And at the end of it, I was thrilled when the epidemiologist said to me, actually, we've had a 38% reduction in neonatal mortality. We trebled the dose and we had the impact that we thought was necessary. So that was actually very educational. And what we did then was to go on, and I won't bore you with this, but basically we worked out that in the 3 studies where we didn't have much of an impact, we hadn't got the coverage right, or in the urban Mumbai study, their mortality rates at baseline were already quite low. And so we didn't have an impact on that, although subsequently they've gone on to do, and they're doing some very interesting studies right now on impacts on domestic violence. But in the studies where we had at least 30% of pregnant women attending the groups, only 30%, then you would have this big impact. And we again published this in the Lancet, and then we managed to get the World Health Organization to take this on board. And they spent 2 years reviewing it to show that this could be scaled up as a policy in particularly rural areas of low and low middle income countries, which has happened. And this is what the editor of the Lancet said: it's not a drug, it's not a vaccine, it's not a device. It's women solving problems, saving lives, which was nice because it does distill down the essence of what this is about. And the next question was, well, can it really work at scale? And the woman at the bottom of this slide, Atia Ahuja, who was the Secretary of State for Health in Orissa, and Orissa is 50 million people, said she really liked the research that had been done there by the East India Group. And so she said, I'm going to scale this up using our budgets. And she set up a whole program of 140,000 women's groups. And it took off and people really liked it. And from the evaluation that we had, it wasn't a randomized trial. It seemed to be beneficial. And subsequently, people have gone on to do other studies as well. And this one is really interesting because this was published a couple of years ago. We set up, again, a study in Bangladesh, this time looking at diabetes and pre-diabetes in adults. And we said, well, you know, maybe we could look at, we had 96 villages, 32 were a control, 32 we gave mobile phone messages in Bengali twice a week through carefully scripted intervention. And in the third group of 32 villages, we had men's groups and women's groups. They decided to gender separate. They talked about things around nutrition, physical exercise. Women who previously had not been allowed to go out at night were now allowed to go in a group. So every night they would go off in a group and chat and all the rest of it. And we reviewed at the end of it. And at the end of it, to our real surprise, we showed a big impact in the group approach to reduce the prevalence of diabetes and pre-diabetes. And it's one of the highest rates in the world in Bangladesh. And the mHealth had some impact on younger people with diabetes, but no overall impact. So it shows that there's something about groups which are very different from simply giving education and messages. And then I went back to Nepal in 2015. This was a few years after we had done the studies with women's groups. And there'd been a terrible earthquake, and I went back to Makwanpur. And we were pleasantly surprised to find that the groups, many of the groups, we estimated about three quarters were still running and had become very active in supporting the rehabilitation from the earthquake. And this was an example of a friend of mine, Narayan, who was a marathon runner, and he went round. This is actually the outskirts of Kathmandu Valley. He was a builder, and he mobilized teenagers to build a community center that had been destroyed using rammed earth building, which is basically sandbags mixed with a bit of mud and cement, basically. And then they built this, and they built this in 2 weeks. And there is the completely renovated, nice community center for teaching and looking after elderly people. And it was opened immediately by all the politicians. There's Prachanda, the head of the Maoists, the head of the Royalists, the head of the United Marxist-Leninists, bottom right. So how do groups work? Well, they're not simple. It's not just about exchanging messages. It's about sharing memories. It's about building solidarity. It's about taking a holistic approach, because groups understand their local context. By working in a group, you reduce your stress. You can share resources, you can share information. There's a phenomenon that the economists call consumption smoothing, where in a crisis, you will share some resources. And so you've got a kind of inbuilt local safety net. You will agitate for resources. So if people are not supplying services or bed nets or whatever, and then you will ask some of the more fundamental questions about why things are as they are in your local community. So there are many complex processes going on. And I like this, that this is a quote actually from Karl Jaspers, who's a philosopher. Existential communication in groups, it's not so much exchange of messages, but more dimensions of intimacy, trust, openness, frankness, and loving struggle. A forum where all kinds of power and superiority, prejudice and calculating strategic reserve against the other are eliminated. And certainly in Bangladesh, many of our women over the past 15 years have gone on to elected office in local communities. And I think this is a more subversive and positive and creative method than we think in all kinds of ways. So let me just briefly talk before I end. What time is it? Yeah, we're still okay. About, and why I wrote the book was, well, hang on, we live in one of the most individual, lonely periods of human history in the West that we've ever known. Half of elderly people over 75 live alone and only have TV as company. We're all obsessionally individuals, we're told by the economists, who sit on our mobiles and game or sit on our computers and don't talk to one another. And there are many problems, and I've listed them here. that might be tackled by a more social, cooperative approach if we could get it to work, and also to work at scale. And I'll talk about just a few of these. So depression and anxiety is the commonest form of illness in the world. And basically, our armamentarium is antidepressants or cognitive behavior therapy, now delivered largely by computer, or maybe an individual. And yet groups, as we showed actually in our East India study, have a powerful impact on relieving certainly mild, moderate depression, and could be much more therapeutic if they were enacted at scale in different ways. Obesity is a global pandemic, and yet, and of course there are structural reasons for this, that we're bombarded daily by inappropriate industrialized foodstuffs in all our markets. We are bombarded by fossil fuels that we don't have active transport. But there are ways in which we could get together, hopefully, maybe, if we did some trials to see if we could improve the risk factors of obesity. The loneliness, I mean, the medical industrial complex, which spends billions, almost trillions each year on drugs and all kinds of things, massive numbers of big trials. And yet I couldn't find a single cluster randomized trial to look at a large scale intervention to reduce loneliness in old people. And that's why in the book I've suggested a way of doing it. Not one, not a single large scale trial to evaluate it. Prisoner rehabilitation, we know, is extremely important because recidivism is so high. And this is a guy on the right there, he's called Peter Wolff, who's a career criminal, who about 10, 12 years ago attacked the guy on the left called Will, who lived, I think, in somewhere in North Kensington. And they wrestled, he was breaking into his house, and they wrestled and fought and went outdoors, and he was arrested. And 3 years later, as part of a restorative justice program, the two met. And Peter Wolff said, yeah, I do remember when we met. And Will said, hang on, we didn't meet. You attacked me in my home, and it's caused massive distress to all my family. And they had a long conversation about this. And afterwards, Peter Wolff, for the first time in his long career of burglary and being in and out prison, realized that he was having an impact in ways that he hadn't fully appreciated on other people's lives. And he did start to reform. He came out of prison, he got married, he wrote a book about his own experiences. He'd been severely physically and sexually abused as a child, and they go around and give talks together as part of the Forgiveness Project. So that was, and I think when I asked him, and I said, look, did probation work? He said, no. And I said, well, what would groups work before you leave prison, talking about what you might do, how you might get accommodation, jobs, and all the rest? And he said, well, it might do. I mean, it would be worth experimenting with it because nothing else works. He said, I would often be discharged from prison and commit a crime within 18 hours in order to get money for drugs. Adolescents, we all know they're happy, smiling people, but also have their moments. And one of the recent things from the Lancet Commission on Adolescence is that they basically love two things after the age of 12, which is they don't love us anymore, but they do love peer groups and mobiles. And I find it astonishing, again, that I can find no trials to look at the impact of working with younger adolescents, given that their nutrition, their activity, their relationships, their concept of masculinity, drug use of alcohol, sexuality is all developed between the ages of 10 and 19. And I've tried to catalyze, there's one trial that was going on in India, and unfortunately the end line investigation of that trial happened during the COVID pandemic. And so that's going to be a very difficult study it will probably have to be replicated. Finally, our house is on fire. That's a picture from Australia, where fires had forced people onto the beaches. And we're all being impacted by climate change, every region of the world. And, you know, it's children actually that are reminding us right now that we have very little time if we're going to give them a reliable future. And there are all kinds of problems that really, to get down to a 2-degree limit, which most scientists agree is something we must do if we're going to avoid catastrophic tipping points. Yet we're heading up the red line there, and we have an extremely high risk climate future. I'll skip that. Finally, on COVID, we know that the essence of tackling COVID is actually a social intervention alongside the vaccines, and fast preventive action could really reduce the spread of this disease. And that's what WHO said back in January 2020. And of course, behavior as well is very important, whether it's hands, coughing, masks, social distancing. But we know that didn't happen in many countries, including our own. We know that in South Korea, where they acted very fast, they currently have about, I think it's gone up to about 35 deaths per million, but they jumped on it extremely quickly and only had to test up to about 15 to 18,000 people at the peak to get their first wave under control. When we look at China, they have had an even more successful time, and they have organized armies of people to go out and make sure that tracing is done and that you crucially isolate people. And I won't go into all the details, but currently China has seen 3 deaths per million population. Yet in a wealthy country like ours, we're heading up towards 2,000 deaths. And there are a whole number of reasons for that maybe we could talk about later. But we did not act early. We did not come up with an army of people to try and suppress this. We did not mobilize communities in the way that I think was essential and necessary, as has been shown in previous epidemics. Finally, I think we need to stay optimistic despite the challenges we face from climate and other threats. This is a bit of a name drop. I purely fortuitously, because I knew the organizer of the conference, I met with Bill Clinton about 6 years ago for 10 seconds after he spoke at a conference in Stockholm. And Bill Clinton, whatever you think of him, is quite a good orator. And he said, we're doomed to interdependence. It's the successful states in America that have the most networks of cooperation. And he said, people can do anything as long as they feel that they can make the future better. And so it's incumbent upon politicians to persuade people that there are ways to make your own future better, to take back control in various dimensions, and to get them to vote for you. So I'm going to stop there. You know, traditional health education is thought of a bit like classical music, where everything's written down and you have to stick to the script. But I prefer to think about it as more improvised, like in jazz, and that people, when they're given a structure and themselves and their local groups, they can come up with all kinds of solutions that can make a real difference. So thank you. I'll stop there and go back to Matt and Louisa and Paul.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Anthony. Terrific. Your talk is like your book in that it's a mixture of stories and facts. As I was reading it, I kept being taken away by stories and then coming back to the facts. Now, but while Louisa prepares her first question and then Paul his, I want to ask you the very first question. And you touch on self-help groups, but then you seem to indicate that they are not sympathy groups. Can you just briefly, because there feels like there's a similarity, what's the difference between your sympathy groups and self-help groups?
Yeah, well, there is an overlap there. To me, the best way, I use an acronym to describe the benefits of a sympathy group, and the acronym is benefits. So you have beneficiaries. I mean, within a sympathy group, you come together in order to do something that's going to benefit all of you. You have an enabler or enablers who kind of facilitate the group, bring it together and set the agendas. You have a focus subject, so you will have, you might have a credit group or a health group or a forestry group or a farming group or a sports team or a music group or whatever. So there'll be a focus to it. You'll then iterate it. So you will have multiple meetings to come up with a strategy around that focus. You'll, in the process, build a lot of trust amongst people, and you'll end up with implementation of strategies. So that's the kind of acronym benefits: beneficiary, enabler, focus, iteration, trust, strategy. And some self-help groups do that. I mean, they are a subsection of it, but not all. Sometimes self-help groups are a little more than casual meetings with a much more limited objective, if you like.
Okay, Louisa. Thanks, Paul. Anthony. Louisa.
Wow. Well, there's so much there. It's brilliant as well to see the impact of basically people having friends and talking about stuff. And I'm assuming that you've imparted the information to the theme, I guess, and the messages to these sympathy groups before they start. Otherwise, they'll just keep talking around the same subject as they always have. But it did remind me, and anybody who knows me, I'll go, oh, she's talking about that again. It did remind me of bonobos and the theory of why bonobos have a matriarchal society rather than, patriarchal like chimps do. And the idea is that their part of the Congo was very resource rich. So they were able to form friendships and alliances and keep under control the much larger males. And it did strike me that this is kind of like it's in the traditional woman's world, isn't it? This idea of a sympathy group, the kind of the domestic, the relationships, the family. And I'm glad you said that it should be improvised like jazz, because I think sometimes there's too much quantifying of what we traditionally know and have known for, throughout our evolution. So yeah, if you can make a question out of that to answer.
No, I'm glad you mentioned a chimp, because I took out a slide where I had a chimp on it. So, there are certain, cooperation is relatively rare within the animal kingdom, and even amongst primates. Chimps, a chimp mother will attack anyone that comes close to her baby for at least 6 months, anything up to a year. Whereas, in human, it takes a village to raise a child. The first thing you do is give it to sisters or grandmothers or mothers-in-law or whatever. And so there is a much more constructive, and there are certain like I think marmosets and bush-tailed tamarins who have a more cooperative view of childcare and nurturing. So I think it is very interesting to look back anthropologically and archaeologically at how things have worked. So if that's the question you're asking, I think it is important to look at this. And I mean, there are other aspects of this, like, why would cooperation help you? If you believe the Darwinian view that basically it's all about competition and we're all up against each other. But actually, even Darwin came up with the view that cooperation was actually quite important. And of course, if you're saving your family's life, then you're saving your genetic future, even if you sacrifice your own life. If you're saving your cousins, you're perhaps less likely to do it, but you're still going to save your inheritance. But then you get into altruism, where actually you save a complete stranger's life. So, and then you get into quite complex issues about who you were most likely to save, and there are all kinds of mathematical theories about all of this.
Okay.
But I won't go into that because I don't really understand it.
Thanks, Anthony. We just need to get the questions in, otherwise we'll run out of time. So sorry about that. Paul, unmute yourself. Paul, you need to unmute yourself first.
Yes, I am unmuted. Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Well, I'm very in favour of the group work stuff, Anthony. I'm a little bit more, need some more convincing on the natural sympathy group number, maybe. Recently at the Swindon Philosophical Society, we were talking about Joseph Heinrich's book, The Weirdest People in the World. I don't know whether you've come across it, but his argument is that we're unusual in the West, and that for most people, for most of history, in most places, the thing that matters more than any other thing is the extended kinship network, is your brothers and your sisters and your first cousins and second cousins and third cousins. And it's that kind of kinship network that you live within, and that, you know, it's your obligations within that, and that's where you're probably going to find your marriage partner, and those people are going to help you out when things go wrong. So your sort of sympathy group for most of history has been your extended kinship network, and that's not around, is it, in the West? So I'm wondering whether we're looking for something that's an alternative to that, maybe, Anthony.
Yeah, well, sorry, just on that book, I saw that book today. Somebody had tweeted something about it and I'd never picked up on it. I can't remember where I read it, and I thought I must get a hold of a copy. Who's it by? Joseph Heinrich, did you say?
Yes, it is. It's a great book, yes.
Yeah.
Joseph Heinrich, The Weirdest. Weird stands for Western Educated, Industrialized, Rich, Developed.
Right.
And he's there.
No, I mean, look, I'm not pretending that, and I don't think even Robin Dunbar is saying that the sympathy group is the panacea for everything, not at all, nor that there aren't much more complex, relationships across society. But what he is saying is even within kinship groups, there will be small groups that come together for a particular function. So, in rural Nepal, which was a little bit like living in the 15th century, in the district, we were 2 days walk from a road. It's absolutely true that you would have quite an extended caste group in your area. So whether they're Muggers or Tamangs or Nawars or whatever, they would have quite an extended group. But within that, there would be, so for example, you always have your funeral group, which is the most important thing. At the moment, funeral groups will be extremely active in India and Nepal, because the one thing that you must do when you die is to make sure that you get cremated in honorific ways and move on to the next life. And that transition is very important. And you have, I'm trying to remember the name, but anyway, a funeral group that will ensure that happens. And it's usually about a dozen people. Now, the figure of 15, one question to Dunbar was, oh, well, hasn't it all changed with Facebook and Twitter? And yet, actually, he went and did a big survey of people who were on Facebook and Twitter and said, yeah, but how many people do you actually consider are your friends? And how many do you think you would, know about? And he came up with figures that averaged around about 13 for the sympathy group and about, I can't remember, 130 for the kind of extended network. So, even though, I'm on Twitter and I do it a lot because I kind of find it interesting, a way to collect information and have debate. So it's got its downsides, of course. But I don't know most people there. It's not the same kind of format of relationship. Now, your question is a good one. In an urban situation, I'm sitting in London at the moment, would it be possible to make this happen? I think this is interesting, the Zoom, because a Zoom, I'm involved in this thing called Independent Sage, and we have about 12, 13 people on that. And we sit there in a and we come up with ideas each week and answer questions from the public about issues relating to COVID and anything else. And so it is possible to move some of this function online. And I think within the workplace, there are lots of ways and formats within which companies organize themselves around sympathy groups, but I think many of them could do it much better and in a more systematic way. But you know, I must get back to that book and read it.
Okay.
And,
Okay.
you know,
Okay.
sorry.
So no, we want to focus on your book, not that one, but even though it's a great book. Another question. A few years ago, previous prime ministers talked about big society and people volunteering and doing things that would not only help society, but would also help them, was the notion that they connect and so on. And something emerged that was not promoted by that, but it emerged by itself. And it's called Park Run. And it's to do with running. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's entirely, well, it began with a very small group. In fact, it began with an individual. And even though it's about running and walking and volunteering, one of the key things that has emerged from it is that it's a kind of communion of connectedness, of people speaking to one another who would not normally have done so for all sorts of reasons, different backgrounds, all sorts of things. So they come together with this common interest. And and it's health changing and world changing. It's just growing. Is it possible for these small sympathy groups to actually emerge on a big scale? I mean, you mentioned Greta Thunberg and things like that. So is that what you're advocating in the West? In the West, I now want to focus in the West, Anthony. Is it possible?
Well, I think personally it is, and certainly it should be experimented on. You know, if, you know, for example, well, on park run, I do know park runs. My wife does park runs. I've done it once or twice. I go along there quite often, and I think it's a very interesting experiment. I wouldn't call most park runs now have, you know, anything between 50 and 100 people running, and it has elements of sympathy groups. Probably the organizing committee of the park run is a sympathy group, and the rest would be a kind of extended group. But the real question is, are there ways in which we can tackle our 21st century individualized society, which is so based on individual competition and individual approaches to health? I mean, we completely failed, in my view, to set up and mobilize a comprehensive local response to the social aspects of COVID. And yet it was done within 2 weeks in China. It was done in Korea, in Vietnam, in Thailand, and elements of it done in Finland and elsewhere. But by and large, Western countries failed to do this. And I think it was a lack of commitment by public health people who have kind of forgotten the fact of the social component of it. Go back to HIV, that was self-motivated by gay groups, particularly in the early 1980s, who probably halved the spread of HIV by setting up a whole number of sympathy groups and higher level groups to mobilize communities around it. And in Ebola, the people flying in with hospitals and space smart suits didn't really make an impact until they mobilized communities around two things, which was don't touch dead bodies and quarantine people and isolate them when they got symptoms. So you do have to do this kind of thing. I think loneliness of old people should be investigated at scale by a community response that is tested out to find ways in which it could be implemented. But this is not considered rocket science. You see, we showed a big impact on diabetes in our trial in Bangladesh. We got no press coverage at all. If that had been a pharmaceutical drug, we would have been all over the New York Times because everyone would have said, you know. So I think this social element has been slightly marginalized by the way we approach economics.
Yeah, that's surely so. We come to the last 5 minutes. So Louisa and Paul, do you have either a final point each or a final question each that we can do in 5 minutes?
I'm probably going to refine what I said before, and certainly about the drugs. I think I guess the limitations of science is that everything needs to be quantified, whereas this sort of approach is messy. It's the difference between taking a vitamin pill and eating an apple. And I guess that's again down to our wider point about our economics and how we value relationships over money and, as you say, individualization.
Yeah, although the only thing I would add to that is that I would argue that using both quantitative and qualitative methods together are very important to assess complex interventions. And you can do randomized controlled trials on anything, actually, if it's ethical and if you really want to do it. But you have to accept there will be blurring at the edges of interventions that are complicated. But I think you can do that. And I don't think we've done it enough. In economics, the Nobel Prize winners from 2 years ago, Esther Duflo and Amitabh Banerjee, both got their Nobel Prize for introducing randomized controlled trials into economics. So you can do it, but there needs to be a commitment from policymakers to look at evidence for policies in this way. But you're right, you need both the qualitative as well as the quantitative.
Thanks,
because
Anthony.
a lot of the thing is in the stories.
Absolutely. Thanks, Anthony. Paul.
Yeah, I was interested, Anthony, when you said early on, you mentioned sort of in passing almost, that you thought development, I think in the poor world, was fundamentally about growing trust, which is, I mean, the one place in the developing world I know something about is Nigeria. And of course, in Nigeria, trust is a very big issue because it's connected to the issue of corruption and, trust in public services and willingness to pay taxation and generally get along and cooperate. So, yeah, I wonder whether you might want to expand on what you.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I do actually have quite a section on this because I was drawn to the work of Sir Partha Dasgupta from Cambridge, who has done a lot on the economics of trust. And the converse of trust is corruption. People, as you say, making, private gain from a public good. And basically, his argument is in sophisticated economies, we've built what's called the Grimm strategy that, I'll deal with you if you know that you're going to get money from me for buying your product. And you will accept that if you don't deliver the service, we will not have any relationship in future. And that's the way it kind of works. And so if you go into a shop and they give you a terrible service, you never go back. And that's how, but in developing countries, that doesn't really exist. You have to accept that you're going to be working with public services of low quality, private services that cheat you, and yet you don't have much option, that you have to negotiate your way through it. And, Dasgupta's done modeling showing that as trust goes up, you get a much bigger economic benefit over the longer term because you have the rules of institutions and the like. And there have been all kinds of Nobel Prize winners who've done economic, studies around this kind of stuff. So corruption is a fascinating topic because all countries are corrupt in different levels and to a different measure. Some, as you say, like Nigeria, are notorious for it, but it doesn't help them in the long run. And they've somehow got to find ways of building the structures that will enable them to have a more secure and integrated and institutionalized future. But that's a huge issue. But I became convinced that actually building trust is fundamental to development and something that happens. And that's why actually sleazing government is not a good idea. It's not just a kind of added on cost that, a few people take a few backhanders. It undermines the whole structure within which we work. And therefore we have to maintain standards as much as possible in financial sector, in the business sector, and in the political sector as well.
Anthony, thanks very much. I'm afraid we've run out of time. And as your wife said, this is a thick book, and it could be 2 books, but it's great. I mean, we haven't even had a chance to get onto the part 2, Trials of Wicked Women, which is a wicked chapter title if ever there was one. But it's not funny, actually. I've read it and it's not funny, so I shouldn't be making fun. Is there a last point you want to make, Anthony, before we wrap?
Well, I mean, the overall message is that there is a social dimension to health and a social dimension to the way we live that can be experimented on and that is critical. We're not just in a technical world where everything is decided by phones or computers or vaccines. The social dimension is extremely important. And that's why I wrote the book, because I think there are ways in which we can evaluate different kinds of social interventions to improve our lives in all kinds of ways.
You're in very good company, Anthony, because already 2 other authors this week have said exactly what you've just said.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they were talking about touch, and they were talking about talking, and how that aids well-being in ways that really are provable. To our co-interviewers, the Swindon Philosophical Society and the Swindon Festival of Literature says, Paul Archer, Louisa Davison, thank you very much. But most of all, from the Swindon Philosophical Society, you'll come back again, Anthony, and the Swindon Festival of Literature, we say, thank you very much, Anthony Costello. Here is the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you.